Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for giving up your evening and your time to join us on what I hope will be a very interesting hour on multi-species. My name is Ben Wixey, and I am the National Agricultural Sales Manager for Germinal. A bit of housekeeping before we start. We are recording this session so that we can make it available on an email in the next few days and maybe next week, so people that aren't able to join us can watch it at their leisure. There is a question and answer button, Q&A button on the menu bar. Please ask questions as we go along. We will try and answer all the questions at the end. Those that we don't answer, we'll answer in the email chain that will come to you next week. There is normally a chat function in these webinars, but we've disabled that for tonight because what happens is we record the sessions. If anybody writes the questions in the chat function and we don't get to it, when we stop the recording, we lose all that information. So if you write them in the Q&A, we'll get to them as soon as we can. We are a member of ROSA for the registration of sheep advisors. And if you are also a professional member of that body, then you can get points for tonight's webinar. So first of all, I'd like to introduce the speakers, which is kind of funny because one of them is having trouble logging on. But Dr. Mary McEvoy will be here hopefully any minute now. She is our Technical Development Manager for Germinal Ireland. And also, as you can see on the screen there, is Professor Tommy Boland from the University College Dublin, from their School of Agriculture and Food Science, specialising in rumen nutrition and sheep husbandry. But as I've got you captive audience, many of you won't know who Germinal are or what we do. So I just want to spend a few minutes just explaining who Germinal are. We are a 6th generation family owned business. We have 200 years experience, 150 years of that are in the seed trade. And we are breeding, multiplying and selling forage species to merchants across the trade. We don't sell direct to farmers, although we work closely with farmers in a trial capacity and also in an advisory role, but we don't actually sell to farmers. We support the merchant trade and work that way. We are directly active in Germinal GB, in GB, in Northern Ireland, in Ireland and in New Zealand, and we sell our genetics to 25 other countries around the globe. We work with like-minded, normally family, independently owned businesses in those countries, places Australia, South and North America, Japan, and of course, mainland Europe. We grow just over 4,000 hectares of grass seed in the UK for production purposes. And we do that with that grass seed goes through Germinal GB and Germinal Ireland to merchants and onto farm. We grow clovers mainly in New Zealand, but we grow red clover all around the world, America, Chile, France, New Zealand, and for the first time ever, we've had a harvestable crop in Hereford in England. So hopefully that's the start of something bigger for the future. We try and bring innovation and quality in everything we do. We have got a bit of a track record for it. We introduced, before the turn of the century, high sugar grass into the market. We've introduced hybrid brassicas. And back in the early 2000s, we used Puna chicory in agricultural mixtures. We've also got aberlasting, which is a rhizomatous clover. Most clovers are stoloniferous. Aberlasting has stolons and rhizomes, which makes it more drought resistant in drought prone areas. And there are other projects in the pipeline. We're developing the breeding on polyunsaturated fatty acids to try and make the grass, every mouthful of grass that's taken, more energy dense. We've got stoloniferous red clovers, which we think in time will change the way we think about red clovers and the grazing habits on top of that. The quality comes through in the seed. Obviously, we're growing it in this country and also in the supply chain we use, the customer support desks and the account managers that we have in the team dealing with merchants. So to back up that innovation and quality, we have started Germinal Horizons. And Germinal Horizon is made up of 3 research centres, and it's our commitment to meaningful sort of research and development and part of the vision to support a productive and positive future for agriculture. 20% of the people that work for Germinal are employed in the research and development teams. I think that's quite a major statement on what we think of that area. Going back to these research centres, Aberystwyth University, the Institute of Biological, Environmental and Rural Sciences, which is obviously a world-renowned grassland research centre. We've 17 staff embedded there in the research team, and they are further supported by dedicated technical teams at Germinal Horizons Wiltshire and Germinal Horizons Lincoln in New Zealand, where we undertake replicated plot trials, as you can see in the pictures there. And then after that, we run farm trials to make sure that the forage concepts and solutions we think we've developed work practically on farm and work with everyday farming solutions. So that's a bit about Germinal Horizons. The plant breeding side of things, the pioneer breeding program, is not the same as other grass breeding programs. And it's developing forages that are high yielding with maximum quality, but also very importantly these days, working towards net zero production for the farm. And we're doing this by breeding forage crops that are resistant to disease, to drought, to flooding, and to cold temperatures, which is important considering we're working across the globe. We're trying to breed grass varieties that are more have more efficient use of the soil nutrients by the plants, and we're trying to reduce the imported protein that's coming in by efficient use of protein of the plants that we're producing in polyphenol oxidase and red clovers and tannins and things like that. We're trying to reduce the methane emissions per production unit, and we are altering the root structure of the grass plants that we're breeding so that we can help in drought tolerant or drought prone areas and flooding, and also maybe not relevant to tonight, but holding up water events on mountainsides and hills before it moves down the valley. So there's lots of breeding work going on. On top of that, we're also involved, as I said, on farm trials. There are 30 different trials of aberroot, our new Festilolium perennial ryegrass, which is on the recommended list, and we feel that's got a big part to play in the future in drought tolerance. So that's on 30 farms and different universities around the country to look to see how that's performing. We have undersown maize trials, as in the picture, multi-species trials all over the country, drought tolerant mixture trials, and even triticale trials after maize. We run a training course every year for agricultural grassland advisors, and over the last 20 years, we think we've trained nearly 2,000 people on that course. We undertake research project with major food retailers and other significant science and research organisations, as Aberystwyth, obviously, Nottingham University, Leeds University, Cheggers, AFBI, Rothamsted, and University College Dublin, where we are actually supporting Jonathan Higgins in PhD work. Tommy might talk about that later. And one of those projects that came out was with Waitrose, and the result of that was a sustainable forage protein book, which is pages and pages of really good detailed work on how to grow different proteins at home, how to utilize them, how to graze them, how to harvest them. And we've got copies of that available digitally if you want that afterwards. With the way the markets are going, it might not be a bad read. Good starting point. And if you want that, there'll be a survey at the end. Put in that you want us to send a copy of that, and we'll send a digital copy on to you. We've also created a net zero productive grassland partnership, which is working to help grassland farmers achieve net zero by 2040. And we're working with Aberystwyth University, with food processors, retailers, farmers, the NFU, AHDB, Innovate UK, and merchants to try and highlight the path to net zero. And by watching this webinar tonight, you're some of the way along that path, because obviously a lot of the benefits with multi-species tick a lot of the boxes of working towards net zero. So, we're making a good start. I want to just start now with a poll of you guys. It's time for you guys to do some work. I want to know, please, just a bit of fun. The results will not be published or anything like that. Do you currently use multi-species lays? The answers that you've one answer, no, not at the moment, but I am interested. I'm using perennial ryegrass and white clover, 2 to 3 species, swards with 4 to 6 species, or swards with 6 species or more. We are well up over 150 people, and we're getting along there. You don't have to take part in this, but appreciate it if you would give us an idea of what the audience is. Okay, so we'll 116 seems about. So I'll share the results of that now. So a lot of people, 116 of you have just taken part, and the majority of people are not growing them at the moment, but interested in them, or using swards of 2 or 3 species, which we would consider to be perhaps a perennial ryegrass and a white clover sward. But a fair number of you, what's that, 30, 50, 30, 42 people are using swards of 4 or more species. So good, thank you very much for doing that. And finally then, I just want to talk a bit about the background of the multi-species. Obviously the benefits and the potential of multi-species swards has been widely acknowledged for many years. They're nothing new. They've been around for hundreds of years. They've only become fashionable again in the last sort of 20 years. And there's plenty of evidence to prove that the strong relationship between increased plant species and yield. And there's also obviously the potential to increase carbon capture in the soil. We already know quite a lot about the properties of the individual species within the multi-species ley, but we know far less and we understand far less in detail about how these species really fit together. How many species do we actually need? What subspecies do we need? How do they yield when they're grown together? What quality are they? How do they persist? And are they getting greater animal intake? Are we getting better live weight gains? These are the sorts of questions that we're trying to answer at our research station. And I know Tommy's working on a lot of them as well. And Mary will, in her presentation in a minute, show some of the initial findings we've had from the research station in Melksham. Obviously, in multi-species lays, you've got legumes and herbs, the legumes fixing nitrogen clearly, and the herbs and legumes working at higher temperatures. So there's a drought resistance potential to some of those, and they all have different seasonal growth. And it's this mix of characteristics that hopefully leads to the higher live weight gains that I think Tommy will allude to. But multi-species, just a word of caution, are not the answer to every situation. They're not a silver bullet, and you do not want the whole farm down to multi-species. Many of the species, the herb species in particular, won't survive or won't establish even on the wrong soil type, on the wrong drainage type. So the species, some of them can be short-lived. Now, they might have phenomenal production facilities and qualities while they're there, but they might only last 2 or 3 years. So don't be thinking that a multi-species sward is going to last 9, 10 years. We don't believe it will if you're grazing it intensely for production. If your goalposts are slightly different, it may last longer. The swards tend to be more open depending on what was in them originally, especially in the spring. So caution is required. You need to understand what your goalposts are. You need to understand what conditions you've got, what management you're going to overlay on the top of the sward before selecting a mixture that hopefully is right for you. Right, thank you very much. That's enough from me for now. Mary, can I ask you to take yourself off mute and share your presentation with us?
Thanks, Ben. Sorry, I had some slight technology problems there, so a bit late to join in, but got in the end. Can you see those slides okay, Ben?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. So good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar this evening. So I'm going to speak about some of the work that has went on at our Germinal Horizon research farm in Wiltshire. And all I am doing is presenting some results today. Full credit is due to the team who's working hard here. Joe Matthews, who's managing team, and Grace Welling, Claire Jeffries, and Eleanor Francis were also involved in the harvesting and analysis of this data. So they're really the ones who deserve full credit for this. So I suppose before I begin, some of the key points that I want to, and some of the key takeaways from my presentation here this evening, and the work that and from the results we've seen at Germinal Horizon. Our spring establishment is really important to get the most out of our herbal lays. We have looked at autumn sowings, and I suppose you can sow up until early August, but later than that, the temperature and the day length just isn't there, so we don't get the same level of herbs and legumes in particular establishing the later we go. So definitely huge benefits to sowing them earlier in the season. The legume component is absolutely critical. So this is your clovers, be it your white or your red clover. And I suppose most mixed species swards will have a combination of white and red clover. But the legumes are what's fixing nitrogen. They're the species that are allowing us to reduce the nitrogen we're applying from the bag. And they're really bringing a lot in terms of the quality of the sward there as well. From the work we did at Germinal Horizon, we did find that basically adding anything to our perennial ryegrass did improve the performance of the sward. So be that perennial ryegrass and white clover, or the inclusion of the herbs there as well. It did bring a benefit. But I suppose, as Ben said, we need to think about, where is the best fit for multi-species at farm level. It's not going to be something that you broadly recommend across all farms, but they do have a role, and I suppose that's something we discuss later on here this evening as well. And they did some very detailed work in the research for this project, and did a lot of detailed work on separations in terms of looking at the different components, looking at when different species were contributing to the sward. And also, I suppose, looking at the quality of those species across the season. So some really interesting results on that front. And I suppose it's clear to say that what you put into the mixture really does affect both the yield of the sward across the season, but also it will influence the quality of the sward as well. So that is important to bear in mind. So just to put it into context in terms of where this research farm is, it's in Wiltshire, which is not too far from Bristol, probably about an hour east of Bristol. You can see the red dot there on the map. That's where the research farm is located. It's quite a dry site. The average rainfall down here would be about 840 millimeters or so across the year. So a lot less than what we'd be seeing on the west coast of Ireland in particular, but quite similar to parts of the east coast. Gets quite cold in the winter. The soil, it's a very good fertile soil. P's and K's would be upper index 3 or index 4 at this site. But there is an underlying clay fraction to the soil here, so it does get very wet on this site when it rains, and I have seen it extremely wet during the winter. But that's just to give you an idea of what we're talking about and what we're dealing with here. In terms of and I'm just going to focus in particular on one trial. There is other ongoing work being conducted at Germinal Horizon, but what I'm going to focus on now is a trial where they looked at perennial ryegrass and white clover. They had a 6-species mixture in there, which had perennial ryegrass and timothy as your 2 grasses, white and red clover as your 2 legumes, and chicory and plantain. And for all the Irish farmers on tonight, that's going to be very similar to the scheme that the department are about to release there in terms of their multi-species measure. So it'll be similar to the components of that 6-species mixture here. We also had an 8-species mixture where we had perennial ryegrass with the addition of 3 grasses. There was the white and red clover included there as well, and chicory and plantain. We had a 12-species mixture which had perennial ryegrass and timothy as your 2 grasses, white and red clover in that as well. It also had Alseep clover, black medic, and birdsfoot trefoil as your other legumes. Chicory and plantain as the 2 primary herbs, and the other herbs in this were salad burnet, sheep's parsley, and yarrow. And just in the interest of making sure we were looking at everything possible essentially, and we threw the kitchen sink at this 16-species mixture. You can see perennial ryegrass with 4 different grasses included in that mixture. Red clover, there was a number of other legumes, Alseep clover, sweet clover, sandfine, and birdsfoot trefoil included there at 11 kilos per hectare overall in this mixture. Chicory and plantain as the 2 main herbs, but also the inclusion of salad burnet, yarrow, sheep's parsley, and lesser knapweed. So basically the 16 species is everything and the kitchen sink. And I suppose we just wanted to test it to see, what was that, what was that going to result in terms of, overall performance and production. I'm predominantly going to focus on the 2021 results here this evening. The trial was sown in 2020 and went into the ground in April 2020. But predominantly for what I want to talk about, I want to look at the full season performance from last year in 2021. So overall, look, it's clear from this that all the treatments performed exceptionally well. The perennial ryegrass produced about 14.8 tons of dry matter per hectare. So nothing to be sneezed at there. Very, very good performance from the perennial ryegrass sward. But you can see there where we add anging to the sward, we're getting the benefits. So the perennial ryegrass and white clover produced just as much in terms of total production as the 6 species, the 8 species, or the 12 species mixture. So these are all in or around equal levels of performance in terms of total dry matter yield, and all producing almost 19 or just over 19 tons of dry matter per hectare. The 16 species mixture produced somewhat less than the other mixed swards in this trial, and it was the worst in terms of the yield of the mixed swards. The reasons for this is we found very poor establishment in terms of some of the secondary legumes. So the likes of the sainfoin, the birdsfoot trefoil, the sweet clover didn't establish near as well as the white clover or red clover would have in the other treatments. And in some instances, we really didn't see any evidence of those species present. And it was similar enough for the herbs. So we went to the addition of extra herbs such as yarrow. They might have been there at sowing, but they were seen. They may not have been seen in the subsequent years. So it's not necessarily safe to say that the more you put in, the better. You need to make sure that what we're sowing into these mixtures are going to perform in terms of the overall productivity of the sward. And I suppose that's important when we're talking about animal performance and supporting production at farm level. If you're looking for just a diverse mixture and putting looking at biodiversity, then obviously the 16 species mixture would have a role. Just a quick look back at then how it performed from 2020. Just again, very similar performance to what we saw in 2021. There's only 5 cuts included here in the 2020 data. So as I said, it was sown in April 2020, and 5 cuts were taken from mid-July for the first cut up to late October. And you see again very good levels of performance across those few months. Most treatments there achieving about 10 tons of dry matter produced from July to October. So we're seeing good performance from the multi-species. If we look at the seasonal profile, and the first thing I want to show you here is just perennial ryegrass, because I think we're all well familiar with perennial ryegrass, and this just puts it into context relative to how the other treatments are performing relative to the perennial ryegrass. As I mentioned already, the perennial ryegrass did yield 14.8 tons, so very good level of production with the perennial ryegrass. This is a very dry site mid-season, and you can see here, that we're seeing quite a severe drop off in dry matter production from late April onwards, and we don't really see that secondary peak that we'd often expect to see in the midsummer period. If we bring in the other treatments onto this slide, again you're seeing very good performance from your perennial ryegrass white clover and your species or your swards where we're including the primary herbs of plantain and chicory in particular. The 16 species mixed performed quite well in the mid-season period there around July, but dropped off significantly thereafter and was the lowest performing species overall come the back end of the year. So it is important just to look at the variation in the profile across the year with the different mixtures. Safe to say that including anging above and beyond perennial ryegrass did give more yield stability. We did get a better supply curve of herbage right across the year. But I think it's clear from this that the perennial ryegrass white clover or the 6 or 8 species mixtures are delivering most in terms of overall performance, and filling those will help fill those gaps, especially on the drier farms. Looking at the composition then and how the sward composition changed over time, and to begin with, I just want to look at the perennial ryegrass and white clover composition. The white clover was relatively slow to establish, and that's probably not too different to what you'd expect out at farm. In July, which was the first cut that was taken off these after sowing in 2020, we saw 8.5% white clover, and this increased up to about 12% white clover in terms of overall contribution to the sward by September. As expected, in 2021, which is in year 2, in April, we saw a very low contribution from the white clover. The white clover is only contributing about 7% in terms of overall dry matter yield there in April, compared to 93% coming from the perennial ryegrass. And that's purely, as you would expect with white clover, You have lower temperatures there in April. You know, white clover hasn't really kicked off. It needs temperatures to improve, and we don't really see white clover coming into its own until, you know, May is when it starts to really take off in the ground. But you can see in July and August that white clover is really getting strong in terms of its overall contribution to the sward. So from 7% contribution from the white clover in April, it's up to 42% by July and 54% of the overall sward by August. So it is increasing dramatically as we progress through the season. If we just look at the 6 species mixture there as well, so this is a perennial ryegrass and timothy with white and red clover, chicory and plantain, and the blue bar there shows the weed ingress as well, which is relatively low and not really worth talking about in this instance. But you can see again early on, we're seeing the herbs performing really well. So plantain and chicory doing really, really well in year 1, and, you know, contributing, you know, not far off 50% of the sward in July and also in September. If we look to year 2, we're starting to see a reduction in terms of the herb contribution. So the chicory in particular is starting to drop off, and this is something we always do talk about. The persistence of chicory is definitely an issue in these swards. We're really probably only seeing chicory persisting for 2 years, or in any great component of the sward for 2 years before it's really starting to thin out. And we're clearly seeing that from the pink light or the pink bar on this pie chart here. The plantain, on the other hand, is holding its own. So the plantain is represented there by the purple slice. So plantain is holding its own much better. We're seeing plantain doing really well in the spring. Drops off a little bit in the mid-season, and this is just purely the nature of plantain in terms of what you would expect from it as well. And again, similar to the clovers, not seeing a huge amount of clover in year 1, but it's increasing dramatically as we move through July and into August in year 2. And, you know, the red and white clover are very much dominating the sward. They're at over 50% of the overall sward contribution by August of year 2. So essentially early on, we're seeing, you know, herbal dominance, and thereafter, you know, we're seeing the clover start to really take their own in the sward. And looking at the 8 species composition as well, and again, I think this is interesting because I just want to look at this one predominantly for to explain how grasses are performing and how the addition of other grasses above and beyond perennial ryegrass are contributing to the sward. So the timothy, coxsfoot, and meadow fescue were included in this mixture. And you can see there in July and September, you know, you're hardly noticing the proportion of any of those grasses other than perennial ryegrass, which are in year 1. So they're slow to establish, but by year 2, we did start to see them, you know, getting established in the sward. They were much more present from April of year 2, and, you know, contributing over 25% of the sward overall there by August. So, you know, some of those grasses slow to establish, but they will get going and they will contribute to the sward thereafter. In terms of the chicory and plantain, again, similar to before, see them very much dominate early in the first year in the year of sowing, and thereafter we're seeing the chicory, which is again your pink bars here. Just use the laser pointer here, might help just explain this point. But the chicory, which is this pinky slice here, the pink slice here, you know, really start to drop off come the end of, you know, the second year of these plots. So again, very consistent with what we saw with the previous treatment as well. And again, you're seeing your clover starting to really dominate by the end of year 2. I'm talking about here, of course, because again, I didn't do any of this work. It was all credit fully due to the team at Germinal Horizon in Wiltshire. But they did separations of all the components in the plots. They also had quality analysis done on the individual components as well. And I'm just going to present some of the qualities. So looking at the ME, and we look at the crude protein content of some of the grasses, herbs, and legumes as well. Firstly, looking at the grass species, as expected, I suppose perennial ryegrass is highest in terms of its overall energy or ME value at all points. Probably it's fair to say across the season, but in the spring in particular. And, you know, this isn't anything different what we'd expect. Perennial ryegrass very high in terms of its quality, and, you know, it's really proven that there in the early part of the season in particular. So and I suppose not much of a difference between the other grasses. You have coxsfoot here, you have timothy here is a dark green. Not much of a difference between the other grasses really at any point across the season the meadow fescue and tall fescue performing quite similarly to the perennial ryegrass in the mid-season period, but they were present in relatively low numbers compared to the perennial ryegrass, and we need to bear that in mind. In terms of the energy or ME value of the legume and herbs, and I've brought the perennial ryegrass into this chart here again, just to put it into context, so we can see how the other species are performing relative to perennial ryegrass, which is what we're all most familiar with. If we look at the chicory and plantain first, chicory had quite a high ME content, and on average was higher than that of perennial ryegrass and plantain, especially in the early part of the season. So, you know, chicory here had an ME value of 11.9 compared to 10.9 for your plantain. Chicory did drop off considerably in the mid-season, in the summer period, and I suppose this was when its biomass was at its highest, so it was producing a lot of material, but its energy did drop off, and this was associated with an increase in the fibre fraction of the plant during the mid-season period, and it recovered a little bit in the back end or in the late season again. So it's kind of gone back into a more leafy plant later on in the year. The white and red clover, you know, the white clover in particular, very high in terms of its energy value or ME value in the spring, and you know, holds that right through the mid-season period, and again performing quite well there in the autumn. And that's kind of what you would expect with clover. We know clover does improve the overall energy or digestibility value of the sward, and you know, it's proven that here in this trial as well. In terms of the crude protein content, then the standard crude protein of the grasses, and look at the early season here first, we had probably fair to say lower crude protein content to perennial ryegrass in the early season than you might necessarily expect, and that was due to the dilution of protein in the leaf of the protein of the perennial ryegrass there, essentially. Protein levels were relatively good for the other species, so the timothy, cocksfoot, and meadow fescues in the early part of the season, but we saw a noticeable drop off, especially with the cocksfoot in the mid-season period. And this is again due to where it's producing a huge amount of, a greater amount of biomass or herbage, and you know, during the mid-season period, what we saw was the other grasses were largely displaying a shutdown. This partly due to quite a dry summer at this site in 2021. In the late season, then we see a return to the trend of the fescue species displaying the highest crude protein levels, but it is important to say, you know, yielding quite poorly here. So, you know, part of that will be due to the lower yield compared to the other species as well. In terms of the crude protein of your legumes and herbs, and again, the green bar here is showing the crude protein content of your perennial ryegrass. Okay, just to keep it all in context, and so we can, you know, so we have something to relate it to. As expected, the crude protein of your legumes is exceptionally high and higher than all the other species right across the season in the early, mid, and late season period. Highest in favour of the white clover, but you know, relatively good there for the red clover as well. The plantain and chicory had a relatively similar crude protein content to the perennial ryegrass at all points across the season. Now I only have a couple more slides, Ben, so hopefully I'm doing okay time-wise, but I just want to look at the effect of nitrogen application, because we also did, and even though I didn't speak about it here today, because generally speaking, you know, we saw no real effect of nitrogen application in terms of total dry matter yield performance. You know, once there was a reasonable proportion of legumes in the mix, they produced as much grass at 150 kilos of nitrogen as we saw in terms of total production at 250 kilos. But the composition of the sward was hugely influenced by the level of nitrogen applied. Okay, so we know that chicory is, you know, relatively nitrogen hungry species, and you know, we did see where we had 150 kilos of nitrogen applied, that the chicory proportion was relatively low, with the legumes having the opportunity to proliferate and to dominate the sward. At high input, the chicory did increase by 12% compared to the 150 kilos, so we had 12% more chicory here. However, it wasn't as protein dense, and therefore it results in significantly lower overall mixture crude protein percentage. So although we had more chicory here, it wasn't as much protein in it compared to the legumes, so the crude protein of the mixture, where we had 250 kilos of nitrogen going out, was slightly lower. Okay, and I just think it's interesting to see how the amount of nitrogen we're putting out is influencing the composition of the sward that we see on the ground. Okay. And I suppose, look, I mean, you know, one of the huge areas that we're focused on at the moment is looking at how we can reduce nitrogen because of, I suppose, both the price of nitrogen here at the moment. It's really, you know, focusing the mind, but, you know, also from an environmental aspect, you know, there is increasing pressure to reduce nitrogen that we're applying, and, you know, to look at what type of sward will best suit that as well. Now, I'm just briefly going to speak about the establishment of multi-species. It hasn't been really the focus of our presentation here this evening, but I would just want to talk about, you know, what we need to think about, and we can talk about this more in the discussion afterwards. We want to choose fields with a low weed burden. That's really important. There is no opportunity for weed control once these are sown, so you want to put them into, you know, with relatively weed-free fields in the first place, and control those weeds prior to sowing. They do like a fertile soil, so they're probably even fussier than a perennial ryegrass. They like soils that are, you know, at 6.3 or above in terms of their pH and P and K index 3. Need to sow them into spring, or it's preferential to sow them into spring, that in the spring into warm soils. And the best way of establishing them is as part of a fuller seed. In order to get, you know, the reasonable establishment of the herbal aspect of the sward in particular, you know, really do need to sow them as part of a fuller seed. We're seeing relatively poor results, or very variable results where they're oversold at the existing swards. In terms of management, the first grazing should be taken when there's 6 leaves on the plantain, 7 leaves on the chicory, and this helps in terms of building up the root of the plant. You know, you're not removing the leaf too early, so it has a chance to put some energy down into the root and help strengthen its root, which will help with the persistency of the plant somewhat. And also we need to bear in mind that they need to withstand the pull test. So, you know, and that's kind of what we would talk about regardless of all seeds. So they have to withstand the pull test, and 6 leaves on the plantain and 7 on the chicory. With a spring sowing, you'll probably get that about 6 to 7 weeks after you sow them. So it's not like you're going to have to leave them any great length longer than you would just a straight perennial ryegrass or white clover seed. Manage them similar to your grass swards on the farm. They do like rotational grazing. So graze them for 1 to 3 days and then allow them to rest. So ideally, you know, a rest period of about 25 days seems to suit them and seems to help in terms of, you know, allowing the chicory or the herb components to build up enough leaf and help, you know, in terms of, you know, putting some energy down into the root. Tactical application of nitrogen in spring will benefit them. You know, they are slower in spring than a perennial ryegrass sward would be. So a bit of nitrogen in the spring will help them, but it's important to bear in mind that the nitrogen will also compromise the legume proportion in the mixture. So maybe go with, you know, nitrogen for your first 2 rounds and then cut it out from April onwards. And I suppose it's important to remember to avoid overgrazing. So maybe graze them down to 5 or 6 centimeters. Don't graze them too tight. You know, leave plenty there at the base for the plants to recover from. So just to summarize, as I mentioned already, spring establishment is important, and this is extremely important for the herbs and legume proportion of your sward. The legume content is what's fixing nitrogen. It's important to remember that. None of the herbs fix nitrogen. A lot of the herbs are hungry for nitrogen. We do need a good establishment of clovers to fix nitrogen and allow us to reduce the nitrogen application. From the work in Germinal Horizon, and you know, this is similar to what we're seeing out on farms, the herbs will dominate initially, but you know, they have relatively low persistency, and the legumes will increase over time and will proliferate over time. So as the herbs begin to die out, you should be left with a relatively good grass legume sward. We did find poor establishment of secondary herbs, and it's important just to say this, I suppose. You know, you have to question, is it worth putting them in if we're not going to see them contribute much to the sward? If you're doing it from a production perspective in particular, and especially when we look at the cost of them, you know, you really need to make sure that what we're putting into the mixture is going to deliver in terms of value. And we did find that, you know, including anaging above a straight perennial ryegrass does improve the yield stability and does improve the overall total dry matter yield performance of the sward. So, you know, whether it's grass and white clover or grass and, you know, clover, plantain and chicory, it does bring a benefit to the sward overall. So I think I'll stop there to give Tommy plenty of time. If there's any quick questions, I can take them there now, Ben.
Mary, just while you're unsharing your screen and Tommy takes over, quick question for you. Can multi-species swards be cut? Can we cut them?
Yeah, look, they can be cut, Ben. I think it's fair to say they probably are more suited to grazing than cutting, and you know, there's big value in terms of grazing them. And Tommy will probably speak that from animal production and from a you know, a reduced worm burden perspective. but they can be cut. They do require a longer wilt than we would have with typical ryegrass silage swards, because a lot of the components there are relatively low in dry matter, so might need 48 hours on the ground, but they can be cut, and silage from them, once it's preserved right, silage from them makes very good feed for animals.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Tommy, can I ask you to?
I think you just went on mute there at the end, Ben, but hopefully you can see my slides.
Yeah, I can see your slides, Tommy.
Okay, thanks very much, Mary. And listen, thanks a million for the opportunity to speak here this evening. And a bit like what Mary has indicated, the work I'm presenting is very much a team effort. And I'd really like to acknowledge all my colleagues and collaborators here on the work I'm going to present, particularly Professor Helen Sheridan, who has been pioneering the work we're doing on multi-species swards in UCD for a decade or more. And I'm very lucky to be working with Helen on this. So what I'm going to chat about for the next few minutes is around multi-species swards and animal performance. But I think it's important as we're looking at any system, and livestock production is a system that we don't get overly focused on any particular metric. So our work at UCD, Lyons Research Farm and in the School of Agriculture and Food Science here in UCD, it's taken a multifunctional approach and a multifaceted approach to understanding what's happening in our livestock production systems, and no more so than when we're looking at multi-species swards as part of our animal grazing system. So we're looking at soil fertility, biodiversity, animal performance, pasture resilience, carbon sequestration, food quality, profitability, water quality, greenhouse gas emissions. And we're also looking at this over the long term. So it's very important that we understand how these swards are going to perform, over 5, 10, 15 years. I'll just start off with a couple of pieces of information around, sward performance, and then some of the environmental and biodiversity measures we've been taking before I get into the detail of the animal performance measurements. And very similar to the data Mary presented towards the end of her presentation, we conducted a whole range of plot or cutting studies between 2012 and 2016, and we're looking at different mixtures fertilized with different levels of fertilizer nitrogen. So the blue box here at the top of the slide just highlights a sward with a high legume content with 60% legumes. That was our target when we established these swards or sowed these swards. As we increased the nitrogen fertilization level from 0 up to 135 kilos nitrogen per hectare per year, basically we didn't see any yield improvement. It was quite stable around 15 tons per hectare. So an additional 135 kilos nitrogen didn't give us any response. This is a high legume containing sward. What happened though? At this point here at 0 nitrogen, the sward consisted of 70% legume. However, at this point here, that legume content of the sward dropped to 40%. So essentially we were substituting the nitrogen fixing effect of the legume by or with the fertilizer nitrogen. And just as a point of reference, this black dotted line across the graph here, that indicates the yield of perennial ryegrass fertilized with 250 kilograms of fertilizer nitrogen per hectare per annum. And as you can see, a number of our swards containing multi-species were out-yielding perennial ryegrass when the perennial ryegrass received 250 kilos at approximately half that fertilizer nitrogen application rate. We've also, again, spent a lot of time looking at multi-species swards in terms of their environmental impact. And this piece of work looked at modeling the nitrous oxide emissions coming from swards that were either perennial ryegrass receiving 90 kilos of nitrogen, perennial ryegrass receiving 250 kilos of nitrogen, or legume containing swards, either a binary mixture with ryegrass and white clover, a simple multi-species sward, or a more complex multi-species sward. And to cut a long story very short, we're reducing nitrous oxide emissions by up to 90% per kilogram of dry matter produced with our multi-species swards compared to our perennial ryegrass sward receiving high levels of fertilizer nitrogen. So again, an important environmental benefit here. Some of the biggest gains we have recorded with our multi-species swards have been in biodiversity indicators, looking at invertebrate populations. And I'm going to give you 3 different groupings or 3 examples of the invertebrates that we have studied. First of all, we have the parasitoid wasps, and the parasitoid wasp is referred to as an indicator species. So essentially, the parasitoid wasp feeds on other invertebrates in the environment or in the system. If the parasitoid wasp population increases, it means that its food source or the other invertebrates have also increased within the environment. And what we can see here is when we have legume and herb containing swards, we see an increase in the parasitoid wasp population. And we also see a similar response with beetles. And again, beetles are a very important indicator of environmental health, and they fulfill a number of important functions within the ecosystem. So by including more diverse swards in our plantings, we're increasing these important invertebrates within the production system. I think some of the most telling results have come with our earthworm studies, and Professor Olaf Schmidt, who is our leading expert in this area within the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Olaf and his team have recorded, I suppose, firstly, huge populations of earthworms under multi-species swards, up to 1.1 million earthworms per hectare. And Olaf tells me that this is equivalent to a live weight of about 800 kilograms of earthworms per hectare, which absolutely blew my mind when I heard that number. And as many people know, when legumes are contained or included in the swards, these are really good at promoting earthworm activity. So we're seeing an increase in the number of earthworms, we're seeing an increase in the diversity of earthworms, and we're also seeing an increase in the activity of those earthworms within the soil. And we know that earthworms have a number of very important roles and fulfill a number of very important functions in our ecosystems. But one of those important roles is when we look at water infiltration rates. So the activity of the earthworm and the earthworms within the soil, it speeds up water infiltration rates. So the water moves quicker into the soil. So this is important in terms of its flood mitigation potential. So that's kind of, I suppose, I start off with looking at something other than animal performance, because I think we can sometimes get too caught up on a single metric such as animal performance and overlook some of these other challenges in our systems, but also some of the other benefits that including some additional plant species into our soil mixtures can actually yield for us. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the animal performance and multi-species swards. And again, as Mary has alluded to in her presentation, multi-species sward, we're using it as a catch-all term. In many ways, it means everything and it means nothing, because multi-species swards really covers a multitude. And I'm just putting up a few pictures here, looking at the range of multi-species swards we have examined over the years. And visually, they look quite different from one another. And in this case, some of these pictures, same sward. So the latter two pictures are the same sward. This image you're seeing now was taken in August in the year of establishment, and this image here was taken in March of the following year. So the multi-species sward, dynamic entity in their own right, and their composition changes from year to year, and it changes throughout the grazing year as well. So I suppose it's one of the areas that does present us with a little bit more challenge when it comes to designing management blueprints for these multi-species swards. So back in 2015 and 2016, we began conducting some animal grazing studies with multi-species swards. And at this stage, we had established that multi-species swards or complex mixtures were out yielding perennial ryegrass, even when our multi-species swards were receiving much lower levels of fertilizer nitrogen application. And this is where I became involved with the research work as part of Helen Sheridan's team, looking at the impact of multi-species swards on animal performance. And I guess we were starting with a vision of, well, let's hope the performance of the multi-species swards is as good or not too much inferior to the performance of the animals on the perennial ryegrass swards. We established a 4-treatment study grazed by ewes and lambs. The swards were all stocked at 12.5 ewes per hectare. Our 4 treatments were a perennial ryegrass monoculture with a relatively high level of fertilizer nitrogen application. And then we had 3 mixtures: a ryegrass white clover mixture, a 6-species mixture containing perennial ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, chicory, and plantain. And we had a 9-species mixture, which contained, in addition to the previous 6 species, cocksfoot, greater birdsfoot trefoil, and yarrow. And all our mixtures received 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum, which was predominantly front-loaded into the first and second grazing rotation. So we collected a detailed range of data on these animals grazing these swards. All were grazed by twin suckling ewes. All were stocked at the same stocking rate of 12.5 ewes per hectare, and all swards were grazed to a post-grazing sward height of 4 centimeters. And the next 3 or 4 slides will carry the same type of structure and layout as this one here. So I'll take a moment just to orientate you to the slide. So the data is presented by the columns in the background. So in this particular case, we're looking at the effect of sward type on lamb weaning weights. I suppose the message I'm trying to bring across with the slide is presented in the red text box here at the front. So when we looked at the performance of the lambs suckling these ewes, compared to a perennial ryegrass sward, lamb suckling ewes which grazed the 6 species sward had a 2.4 kilogram higher live weight at weaning. And I think perhaps very interestingly here, anytime we added anything at all into the sward, which made that sward more complex than the perennial ryegrass monoculture, we were seeing lamb performance benefits. And up to 6 weeks of age, these performance benefits are coming from milk production / consumption, milk production by the ewe, milk consumption by the lamb. So one of 2 things are happening here. Either the ewe is producing more milk, or the milk she's producing has a higher nutrient content, or perhaps the third option is it's a combination of both those 2. Those differences in performance, or those performance benefits, were carried through until the point of slaughter. And when we look at the period it took for our lambs to reach a target live weight of slaughter of 45 kilograms, compared to perennial ryegrass sward, lambs fed any mixed sward reached slaughter 2 weeks earlier. And I think this probably has 2 important savings on a sheep farm. First of all, we're getting those lambs off the farm at a time of year when we're trying to prioritize grass resources, flushing the ewe coming into the mating season or the breeding season. And secondly, by reducing the lifetime of the animal on the farm, we're also potentially reducing those animals' lifetime methane emissions. So again, it's another important environmental benefit potentially, which we need to capture the benefits thereof. And those animal performance improvements are great and they're exciting, and you know, they're very important from a production perspective. We also were examining the effect of sward type on the requirement to dose animals, and these swards contain chicory, but particularly chicory, and we're very interested to understand the impact of the multi-species swards on the parasite burden and the requirement for anthelmintic usage in the sheep production systems. I think, Ben, you mentioned the registry of sheep advisors at the beginning of the webinar. And, you know, one of our major challenges in sheep production systems is essentially the failure of the chemistry to control intestinal parasites in sheep, and there's huge levels of parasite resistance to the drugs we use. So in this study, what we noticed that when animals are grazing multi-species swards, or even a binary mixture of ryegrass and white clover, we were increasing the interval between individual anthelmintic treatments, and we were treating our animals with anthelmintic in response to individual fecal egg counting. So when the animals hit a threshold of 400 eggs per gram, we were dosing with an anthelmintic. So by allowing the animals, or by having the animals graze multi-species swards, we were almost doubling the interval from one dosing to the next, which was a huge saving in terms of labor and anthelmintic inputs. And what that meant is when we calculated the total number of treatments lambs required over their lifetime, compared to the lambs grazing a perennial ryegrass only sward, lambs grazing the multi-species swards required 50% fewer drench administrations over their life. So we're seeing equivalent levels of dry matter production in this study from significantly reduced fertilizer inputs. We're seeing enhancements in terms of animal performance and reduction in the lifetime of slaughter, but we're also seeing a 50% saving in the quantity of anthelmintics required, and all of which are, I think, are very important findings for the sheep industry. However, in Ireland, the sheep industry is certainly much smaller than our beef and our dairy industry. So our next step was to move this work into the beef industry. And I suppose the way the industry has moved in Ireland in the last decade or so, we have seen a big increase in the dairy industry, about 45% more cows in the country now than 10 years ago. And that's resulted in much more cattle coming from the dairy herd as part of our beef production systems. We made the decision to look at beef steers from the dairy herd as our next study. And again, we're taking this, I suppose, broad stroke approach to understanding as much of the system as we possibly can. but I'm just going to focus on the animal performance here this evening. We established 3 swards again. Once again, we stocked these 3 swards at 2.5 livestock units per hectare. We had our perennial ryegrass monoculture receiving about 210 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. Then we had our perennial ryegrass and white clover sward, and we had our multi-species sward, which was essentially the 6-species sward I described in the previous study. And this is all part of the Smart Sward project. The perennial ryegrass and white clover sward and the multi-species sward, both of those swards received 90 kilograms of fertilizer nitrogen per annum. These swards were established in July of 2019. They were grazed just in establishment grazing in the end of 2019. And then in 2020, we started to graze them as part of the experiment. So we had year-old cattle turned out in March in 2020. And this first slide just represents the performance of those cattle. So when we look at the animals grazing our multi-species sward, and indeed our perennial ryegrass and white clover, during their second grazing season, so this was from about a year old to about 19 or 20 months of age, those cattle grazing the ryegrass, white clover, or the multi-species sward had a 20% higher growth rate than their contemporaries grazing the perennial ryegrass sward, even though they all had the same starting point. We also enrolled another, I suppose, generation of calves onto the system in 2020. So these were cattle or calves that started grazing them in June approximately of 2020. And just to kind of orientate you to the data here, the blue columns indicate the weight of those calves at turnout in June of 2020. The brown columns represent the weight of those calves at housing in 2020. The green columns represent the weight of those calves at turnout in 2021. And the yellow columns represent the weight of those calves at housing, or the weight of those steers at housing in 2021. And we can see, I suppose, the most telling difference between the perennial ryegrass cattle and the multi-species sward cattle. There was an 80 kilogram live weight difference. So the cattle grazing the multi-species sward were 80 kilograms heavier at housing in their second year, having basically been on the multi-species sward for the entirety of their grazing life. I will also say that during these housing periods, so going from the brown to the green, during these housing periods, the animals were consuming silage produced from their individual swards. So these multi-species cattle were eating multi-species silage. The perennial ryegrass cattle were eating perennial ryegrass silage during those winter periods. And then we had a third cohort of cattle enrolled on this study in 2021. And these cattle, again, we have the turnout weights here in blue, the housing weights at in November of 2021 here in brown, and we have the weight today. Actually, Lucy just sent me this data this morning of the calves, which are going out now next week back onto the platform as yearlings. The cattle on the multi-species treatment are 42 kilograms heavier than the cattle on the perennial ryegrass treatment. And interestingly, since housing in November up until today, the average daily gain of the calves on the perennial ryegrass silage is 640 grams per day. The average daily gain of the calves on the multi-species is 890 grams per day. So that's about a 50%, so slightly, it's about a 40% increase in housed daily live weight gain. And there was a question, I think, directed there earlier about the silage, and can you cut these swards for silage? You can. The silage that can be produced when it's fed to animals does elicit really, really good animal performance and animal growth rates, much better than the chemical analysis would suggest it should. So there's something very interesting going on here with the performance of these cattle. I will also say that harvesting conditions are really important, and they do require a slightly longer wilt than your perennial ryegrass silage to make good quality silage. I'm going to move a little bit more rapidly through some of the next slides. We've also looked at cattle and sheep co-grazing together. So again, ewes, suckling lambs, and heifers from the dairy herd, a combination of Angus and Hereford heifers. This work is conducted with our colleagues in Devonish at the research farm in Doubt. And in this study, we had an old permanent pasture included, and we also had a 12 species mixture included. And again, the same results are coming through that we're seeing with our sheep and our cattle at lines. Lambs grazing multi-species swards had a 24% higher average daily gain than animals grazing either perennial ryegrass or the old permanent pasture from turnout to slaughter. And again, a massive increase in performance. We weren't seeing exactly the same magnitude of difference, but the animals grazing the 6 species mixture had a 13% higher average daily gain than the animals grazing either the perennial ryegrass or the permanent pasture swards up and down. So the benefits, the differences were there with cattle, but not altogether as pronounced as we're seeing with the sheep in this co-grazing system. I think in an Irish context, it's very important to consider what these swards can do under dairy systems. And again, there's a lot of work going on with my colleagues in UC and colleagues in Teagasc as well, looking at cattle, dairy cattle grazing multi-species swards, probably a little bit earlier stages than the work we've done with beef or sheep. But again, looking at similar sward types that we were using with our beef systems in lines, we looked at the performance of dairy cows. And this particular study was a zero graze study for various reasons at a research farm. And when we offered the swards to mid-lactation dairy cows, the cows which were offered zero graze forage from perennial ryegrass or multi-species swards had a higher forage dry matter intake compared to the animals grazing perennial ryegrass only. Again, very consistent with what we're seeing with our other studies. And this translated for the multi-species swards in these mid-lactation dairy cows to a higher energy-corrected milk yield compared to either our perennial ryegrass swards or perennial ryegrass and white clover swards. And again, that increase in energy-corrected milk yield was translated into an increase in fat and protein yield, or more commonly referred to here in this jurisdiction as milk solid yield. So the animals grazing the multi-species swards or zero graze multi-species swards had a higher milk solid yield in this particular study. Okay, so to try to summarize then, we're all acutely aware, never more so than at the moment, of the challenges facing, well, I've used Ireland here, but UK and global agriculture as well. I'm confident to say now, offering animal swards consisting of more than a single species improves animal performance. And we have numerous sets of data to support this, and there's data from all over the world to support this as well. Where our challenges exist, we do need detailed management blueprints in terms of establishment, grazing, and the maintenance of multi-species swards, potentially including the reintroduction of some of the herbs that Mary has indicated don't persist very well in the swards. We also need to assess the direct environmental impacts under local conditions. And I think we need to be cautious here of taking data from different jurisdictions where there's quite different climatic and growth conditions and directly transposing that onto conditions in either the UK or Ireland. I think Ben probably started this evening's webinar with this comment, and this was non-coordinated, so it's good to see we're both on the same page, Ben. But multi-species swards, they're not a silver bullet solution, but in my opinion, they will form part of a toolbox or an array of solutions which are available to farmers into the future. To try to summarize some of the benefits that we've seen of multi-species sward, I've tried to put some percentage numbers on this and some absolute numbers on it. We have reduced fertilizer nitrogen inputs by 60% with maintenance or increase in the quantity of herbage we're producing, and we're having ongoing discussions about whether we pull nitrogen altogether from our systems, and I think we're probably going to get close to that in the next year or two. We're increasing grass production by our herbage production, I should say, by 12%, despite this greatly reduced nitrogen inputs. We're increasing animal performance on an average of about 20% over our studies. With our beef and our sheep systems, we're accelerating slaughter date by at least a month in the beef systems. And in some of the more recent work Jonathan Higgins has done, we're seeing similar results in our sheep systems. We have reduced anthelmintic inputs by 50%. We've increased biodiversity, increased airborne populations, increased water infiltration rates, and reduced nitrous oxide emissions. And we're currently modeling the full system greenhouse gas emissions. And I would be reasonably confident that when we conduct that life cycle analysis, we'll see a reduction in the carbon footprint of the meat produced across these systems. And hopefully I don't rue those words when we do actually have the finalized data completed. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that, the type of work we do in UCD and other research centers, it's hugely expensive and it's hugely time consuming to do it. And we need a lot of expertise and we need a lot of detailed equipment and facilities to do so. And, I really must acknowledge the funders of this work, of which there are many, and Germinal have been an important funder and supporter of our research work, and Mary and her team here in Ireland have been working very closely with us over the years in terms of sourcing seed and formulating seed mixtures, etc. And the Department of Agriculture and the Irish Research Council and the European Union who are funding our work. And I'll finish up there, Ben, and if there are any questions from the audience, I will attempt to answer them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tommy. Thank you, Mary. There are loads of questions. There are 25 here, not to mention the ones that I had at the beginning anyway. What I would say is there's quite a group that fall into the multi-species establishment area and particular relevance to chemical control of weeds. So I apologize if we're not going to answer your question here. We will do it in the email later on, but we're not going to get to all of these today. But can you guys talk about how you've established multi-species swards from the seed bed? Can we introduce them into existing grass layers is one question. And then going on from that, winter management seems to be another topic that's very interesting. And what is the correct grazing heights? So I don't know who wants to take it first, and I'll chip in as well. But
yeah, so if I kick off there in terms of establishment, so I mentioned about the importance of sowing into clean swards. In terms of, I suppose, weed control, like if there's weed control, maybe if there's like docks, thistles in the field, control them a year in advance. Take them out with a stronger spray. But before you sow your multi-species, I think, Ben, you have to go in and it's a full reseed is the best chance for establishment. So spray off with glyphosate, create a good fine firm seed bed, and that's going to give you the best chance of establishment. With spring sown as well, you're going to get a quicker take, a better take of your herbs and your legumes, hopefully, and that'll also help in terms of to outcompete weeds. We tend not to, and I suppose, Tommy, you can pitch in on this, but where we get good establishment of multi-species swards, where they're sown into relatively clean fields or fields that historically haven't had a weed problem, we tend not to see a big weed issue. They tend to be able to relatively well be able to outcompete weeds in terms of like the herbs. I suppose the chicory and plantain have a similar growth habit probably to the dock, and they probably can outcompete and hold their own space in the sward.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Mary. I think the fine firm seedbed and good soil conditions and good seedbed preparation are crucial. I think if you have a big dock infestation or thistle infestation or something, yeah, and you're going to have that. No, you're going to have that afterwards, and you've no herbicide control measures. At least we don't have in the European Union or in the UK, as far as I'm aware, herbicide that can kill something like a dock or a thistle and not kill chicory and plantain. We have established multi-species swards after cereal crops, which works really well because a reasonable amount of the seed bank in the soil have been depleted during the cultivation and the herbicide applications of the cereal production. We've gone into we've burnt off and gone into old pasture sward, and there tends to be a slightly heavier weed burden in that case. What we have done is attempted to prepare a stale seed bed. So spray off till let some of the seeds, the weed seeds germinate again, spray off a second time, and then go in and establish. What we've done in the last couple of years with some of our older grassland, we've actually sort of put in a break crop of hybrid brassica, red start. I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning that particular variety, and sowing red start as a main crop in April. That does really good things in terms of our sheep performance, our lamb performance as well, and then come in the following April with our multi-species sward, and that does seem to be helping in terms of the weed burdens. Fully agree, with the statement Mary made that if you get a good establishment of your sward, they are quite good at outcompeting the weeds. And when we look at the weed species that are coming into our swards and we compare what we see in our multi-species swards versus our perennial ryegrass swards, there's less weeds coming into the multi-species swards than there is in the perennial ryegrass swards.
Yeah. Okay. We'd have the same problem over here. There's no chemical control for any broadleaf plant in amongst that multi-species lay. What I would emphasize is what you mentioned, Tommy, which is the stale seedbed. Wait, pick your time in the spring. Ideally come on a cereal crop or a brassica crop, particularly red start. Thank you, Tommy. But pick your time, prepare the seedbed, get it rolled down tight, shut the gate, wait 2 or 3 weeks, get a flush of weeds, burn them off, and then drill. And try and do it that way. The other emphasis of a lot of the questions is around winter grazing? How are multi-species lays? How do we manage them going through a winter? Are we in danger of grazing out multi-species lays?
Yeah,
I'm sure. Go ahead, Tommy.
No, you go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, well, no, look, I was just going to say there, you know, we don't want to do any damage in terms of poaching damage to multi-species. You don't want to be grazing them in really wet conditions. So, you know, you probably will close them off a little bit earlier than you closing off your perennial ryegrass swords. Slightly different than maybe how we'd advise to manage perennial ryegrass white clover. If it's perennial ryegrass and just white clover, we'd be saying graze it as late as possible. But with the multi-species, you really don't want to go in wet conditions. You don't want to risk poaching them or grazing them in difficult conditions, because that will definitely reduce persistency there.
Yeah, and again, they're probably slightly more open swords than a perennial ryegrass sward, you know, so they mightn't stand up to grazing in very wet conditions altogether as well as a perennial ryegrass sward will. Also with something like chicory, where chicory has a high kind of proportion in the sward, it's hollow stem, so grazing or cutting in wet conditions will lead to an increase in the disappearance of chicory from the sward. With our beef cattle, we're generally grazing them with the young stock up to the first week of November, maybe into the second week of November, if conditions allow, and turning back out onto those swards in mid-March. We haven't, as of yet, started grazing these swards in, you know, late January, early February, as you know, our colleagues grazing dairy cows on perennial ryegrass or perennial ryegrass white clover swards will do. So you probably do have a slightly shorter grazing season with them then.
Yeah. Okay. And grazing heights. Obviously, does the plate meter work? I know the answer, but you guys tell us.
Well, it'll give you numbers, so it'll work in that sense. How much use those numbers are? Yes, I suppose we would kind of use the plate meter in combination with your eye length, and you know, with multi-species swords, plate meters can be very deceiving. Because you can have areas that are grazed out very, very tight, but your plate meter reading might still be 12 or 14 centimeters. So if you're going solely on the plate meter, we would try, as a rule of thumb, to take the cattle out at around 6 to 7 centimeters of a post-grazing sward height. I suppose at the other end of the equation, in terms of pre-grazing heritage mass, what we have seen over the years is, and I use this term advisedly and carefully, but you will get away with much heavier covers, if that's not the wrong terminology. You get away with much heavier covers in multi-species swords than you would with perennial ryegrass swords without losing quality.
Okay. And I don't know if either of you want to venture an answer on this, but there's a lot of comment and questions about how multi-species swords would behave in lower or even no anorganic situations. My opinion and my natural thought would be that actually they'd be even better in those situations where you're fixing nitrogen. We haven't done any trial work on that yet. The nitrogen applications that we use that Mary alluded to was for animal returns and some others, but we have done no work on no inputs. Does any of you want to hazard an opinion?
Yeah, we have done some work under cutting regimes on zero nitrogen rates, you know, and some of the yields of the multi-species swords have been hugely impressive, you know, up to 17, 18, maybe up to 20 tons of dry matter in some instances under zero nitrogen application rates. But we haven't done that under grazing yet, Ben, and you know, it is a discussion that Helen and myself and other members of the team are constantly having, so we will move closer towards it. But in theory, the sward should hold up pretty well under those circumstances. To date, we have used nitrogen in the springtime, so our first and second rotation, so usually mid to late March and maybe again in mid to late April, we'll go out with about 30 to 35 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in each application on our multi-species swards, and then for the rest of the year we'll allow those swards to work off the nitrogen fixation, and the same for our white clover swards. You know, we did have some concerns that maybe we're disadvantaging the clover or legumes in that approach, but last year we saw, and now admittedly in Ireland last year was a very good year for legumes and for clover, but we were seeing clover contents in our swords of 65 to 70% of the dry matter coming from legumes, which, you know, can present other challenges as well.
And I might just add to that there, Ben. Yeah, look, in terms of organic situations, I think, you know, no different to conventional, like the soil fertility is going to be absolutely crucial. If your P's and K's and pH are good, then, you know, your your multi-species forwards should work fine in a, you know, a zero artificial fertilizer input system. And once you're getting maybe slurry out to feed P and K into the system and maintain P's and K's in the soil, maintain your pH in around that 6.3, and your legumes are going to fix the nitrogen, and you know, you should have I would say you'd have no issue in that organic scenario with them.
Great, good. Okay, one last question that's come up 2 or 3 times. Are multi-species seed mixtures more expensive than perennial ryegrass and white clover lace? Mary, perhaps you want to go first on that one.
Well, Ben, this will upset our English viewers tonight, but yeah, look, they are more expensive. You know, the herbal components definitely are more expensive than, or some of the herbs, I suppose, the chicory and plantain are more expensive than grass or clover would be on a per kilo basis. Our department are about, if they haven't done it already this evening, they're meant to do it very, very shortly. But there is a scheme being announced by the Department of Agriculture over very shortly, and they're going to subsidise multi-species forwards to the tune of €50 per acre or per 12 kilo pack. So in that instance, it would probably make them cheaper this year than a perennial ryegrass sward or a bag of perennial ryegrass seed. So the scheme, I suppose, that the department are bringing out there in that multi-species measure, it's going to be perennial ryegrass, timothy, red and white clover, chicory and plantain, and they have specified the exact ingredients or exact kilogram of each of those species in the bag. But you know, that will reduce the cost to Irish farmers this year.
Right, brilliant. That is a scheme just for the Irish farmers, I point out. That isn't the same scheme in GB. Obviously, there's GS4, which is, you know, verging on the same thing, and but there are other requirements for that. I'm just going to wrap this up now and put up this as a last slide. Can you see that, Mary? We've another webinar in a couple of weeks' time on how to fill the forage gap with the prices and the market situations that we're faced with at the moment. Obviously, there are species and methods of farming that may not have come onto the radar before, when fertilizer and feed is under £300 a tonne, but it's not there anymore, and it might not be for a while to come. So we've got a webinar in a couple of weeks' time, which at the end of this webinar, there'll be an opportunity to sign up for that one, just to discuss and talk about the other options that you might want to contemplate on a farm to produce more energy and protein at a homegrown level. So I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Tommy and Mary, for your time. Really appreciate the effort and the time you put in. Thank you all for listening. There is a feedback form at the end, and we will answer. We've now got 35 questions, so we will answer those in the next few days and get an email out on that. But thank you all very much for attending, and thank you guys for giving your time.